When we look back at history, certain eras feel legendary. They have names. They have timelines. They feel dramatic, important, and world-changing. We talk about them as if everyone living through them knew exactly how significant their moment was. But almost no one did. This video is about a quiet truth that history books rarely emphasize. The most famous eras in history felt completely ordinary to the people living inside them. They woke up, worked, worried about daily problems, and went to sleep without realizing they were standing in a chapter that future generations would obsess over. No one said, "This will be remembered forever." They said, "This is how things are right now." People living in famous eras didn't feel historic. They felt tired. They felt uncertain. They felt normal. Big changes unfolded slowly, hidden inside routine, paperwork, labor, and repetition. History only looks dramatic when it's finished. As we move through this topic, you'll see why living through history feels nothing like remembering it, and why our own time probably feels far less important than it actually is. Before we continue, I'm curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Write it in the comments. Someday, this exact moment will be the past too. If you enjoy calm, thoughtful history that reframes how we see the world, like the video and subscribe. These stories are meant to be experienced slowly, all the way through. Now let's step into famous eras, not as legends, but as ordinary days lived by ordinary people. For the people living through what later generations would call famous eras, life did not feel monumental or significant. It felt like a continuation of yesterday, shaped by familiar concerns and immediate pressures. History, as we understand it now, is a construction made after events have settled, been selected, and assigned meaning. While those events were unfolding, they did not arrive with labels or announcements. They arrived quietly, folded into routine. People did not experience eras. They experienced days. Each day began with practical needs and ended with fatigue. Work had to be done, obligations met, uncertainty managed. Even during periods of major transformation, the structure of daily life remained intact enough to prevent the feeling of rupture. Change did not arrive as a clear break. It arrived as adjustment. Adjustment feels ordinary. This is the central reason famous eras felt unremarkable to those living inside them. Change was incremental. It accumulated slowly, disguised by repetition. A single new rule, a revised expectation, a different demand from authority, none of these felt historic on their own. Each one was absorbed, tolerated, and normalized. Only later did their combined effect become visible. Living forward erases perspective. People can only see a short distance ahead. They do not know which developments will matter, which will fade, and which will be remembered. They respond to what feels urgent, not to what will later feel important. Urgency crowds out reflection. When survival, stability, and adaptation dominate attention, meaning becomes secondary. This is why periods of major transformation often feel exhausting rather than exciting. They involve uncertainty, stress, and constant recalibration. People living through them do not feel like witnesses to greatness. They feel like participants in inconvenience. In hindsight, historians compress complexity into narratives. They identify causes, highlight turning points, and impose coherence. But lived experience is incoherent. Multiple forces operate simultaneously. Outcomes are unclear. Decisions are made with limited information. Confusion is constant. Confusion does not feel historic. It feels frustrating. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that most people were not close to the events we now emphasize. Decisions made at the top traveled slowly and unevenly. By the time they reached daily life, they arrived filtered through interpretation, delay, and compromise. Their impact felt indirect and administrative rather than dramatic. A policy did not transform life overnight. It altered paperwork, expectations, or routines. Those changes blended into the background of obligation. Repetition dulls significance. When people adapt continuously, they stop noticing adaptation. What once felt new becomes normal. Once something is normal, it loses emotional weight. Emotional weight is necessary for something to feel historic. Historic feeling requires contrast. Contrast disappears when change is gradual. People also lack the narrative frameworks we use today. They did not divide time into clearly defined eras with names and boundaries. They experienced continuity. Even when things worsened or improved, they described it comparatively rather than categorically. Harder than before. Different now. Rarely unprecedented. Language shapes perception. Without language that frames experience as historic, experience remains practical. There is also the issue of emotional saturation. When change is constant, people stop reacting strongly. Emotional energy is finite. Continuous stress forces conservation. Concern becomes background noise. Life continues. Later generations interpret this period as dramatic upheaval. Contemporaries experienced it as prolonged strain. Strain feels ordinary. Famous eras are often remembered for their outcomes, not their processes. Outcomes are clean and symbolic. Processes are messy and repetitive. People live inside processes. They rarely experience outcomes directly. Processes are boring by design. They involve waiting, repetition, delay, and partial success. While living through a process, nothing feels finished. Unfinished things do not feel meaningful yet. Meaning arrives with closure. Closure comes later. Another factor is identity. People define themselves through continuity. Even during transformation, core routines persist. Work, family, obligation, rest, these anchors stabilize identity. When identity feels stable, time feels stable. Stability suppresses historic awareness. Even those close to power often lack clarity. Leaders did not act with full knowledge. Decisions were experiments under pressure. Many actions that later appear decisive were taken reluctantly or defensively. They did not feel like steps toward a known future. The future was opaque. Opacity prevents meaning. There is also a survival bias in memory. Those who survive normalize their experience. Those who do not are absent. Survivors adapt, endure, and continue. Their memories emphasize coping rather than significance. Endurance feels normal. History also remembers selectively. It highlights a small number of events and figures while ignoring the vast majority of lived experience. Millions of ordinary days disappear. What remains is a simplified narrative that exaggerates drama. Drama belongs to memory, not to life. People living inside famous eras did not know which moments would be remembered. Many events that felt important vanished. Many that felt insignificant became decisive later. This unpredictability makes it impossible to assign meaning accurately in the moment. Meaning requires selection. Selection happens afterward. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that humans are built to adapt, not to observe themselves historically. Adaptation suppresses novelty. Suppressed novelty reduces emotional response. Reduced emotional response makes even large changes feel manageable. Manageable things do not feel historic. We often assume that people living through famous eras felt a sense of importance or destiny. In reality, they felt uncertainty, fatigue, and responsibility. They were busy managing their lives. They did not have the luxury of interpretation. Interpretation is retrospective. We look backward and see arcs. They lived forward and saw moments. We see conclusions. They lived inside questions. This difference explains everything. History feels dramatic because it is complete. Life feels ordinary because it is ongoing. The most famous eras did not feel famous because fame belongs to memory, not to experience. People lived through change without realizing its scale because scale is invisible from within. And that is why our own time probably feels ordinary too. People living through eras that later became famous did not experience their time as a turning point because human attention is anchored to continuity, not change. Even when transformation was underway, most of what surrounded them remained familiar enough to anchor perception. Roads still existed. Markets still opened. Work still demanded effort. Families still worried about the same immediate concerns. These continuities acted like noise-canceling layers, muting the significance of deeper shifts taking place underneath. Change rarely announces itself clearly while it is happening. It emerges as inconvenience before it becomes meaning. People notice discomfort first, not importance. A regulation becomes stricter. A process becomes slower. Expectations shift slightly. None of this feels historic. It feels like administration, adjustment, or mismanagement. History, however, later interprets these same changes as the foundations of a new era. The reason for this mismatch lies in how humans process time. We are designed to respond to short-term cause and effect, not long-term accumulation. When something changes slowly enough, the mind treats it as environment rather than event. Once something becomes part of the environment, it stops feeling noteworthy. It becomes background. Background never feels historic. Most famous eras were shaped not by single dramatic moments, but by gradual realignments that stretched across decades. Technology spread slowly. Institutions evolved unevenly. Social expectations adjusted one generation at a time. No single year felt decisive. No single day felt like a beginning. Beginnings only exist in hindsight. While living inside these transitions, people framed their experiences using comparison, not categorization. They compared this year to last year, this rule to the previous one, this difficulty to an older one. Comparison shrinks perception. A small difference between yesterday and today does not feel meaningful, even if the difference between decades is enormous. This is why people rarely recognize transformation while it is unfolding. They are too close to see the shape. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that significance competes with responsibility. Responsibility usually wins. When people are responsible for families, work, obligations, and survival, abstract meaning fades. They cannot afford to interpret their lives historically. They must act practically. Practicality narrows focus. Narrow focus eliminates grand perspective. Even during periods of intense change, most people experienced history indirectly. Major developments passed through layers of administration, delay, and translation before reaching daily life. By the time an abstract shift affected routine, it arrived stripped of drama. What reached people were forms, rules, schedules, prices, expectations. Paperwork does not feel historic. Administration does not feel legendary. Yet administration is where history actually settles. Another important factor is emotional normalization. Humans normalize conditions quickly, even difficult ones. What initially feels alarming becomes familiar. Familiarity reduces emotional response. Reduced emotional response removes the sense of exception. Exception is required for historic awareness. Without exception, everything feels ordinary. This emotional normalization is especially strong during long periods of stress. When strain is continuous, people adapt rather than react. They stop asking why things are changing and focus on how to manage them. Management replaces interpretation. Interpretation requires distance. Distance did not exist. People also lacked the narrative tools we use today. They did not divide time into clearly labeled eras. They did not know which developments would matter later. Without narrative framing, experience remains fragmented. Fragmented experience does not feel meaningful as a whole. Only later do historians assemble fragments into stories. Stories feel dramatic. Fragments feel mundane. This is why historical writing often exaggerates coherence. It connects events that were not perceived as connected at the time. It creates arcs that no one living inside them could see. Those living inside the arc felt only segments. Segments feel incomplete. Incomplete things do not feel important yet. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that human identity resists historic framing. People see themselves as continuous beings. Even when surroundings change, the self feels stable. When the self feels stable, time feels stable. Stability suppresses awareness of transformation. Transformation feels external. External change feels manageable. Only when change threatens identity does it feel dramatic. Most famous eras altered systems, not identities, at least not immediately. Identity lagged behind structure. This delay softened perception. By the time identity shifted, the era already felt normal. There is also a psychological bias toward immediacy. Humans prioritize what demands attention now over what will matter later. Hunger, work, obligation, and uncertainty dominate cognition. Abstract significance has no urgency. Urgency defines experience. History lacks urgency while it is happening. Another overlooked factor is that famous eras are remembered through the lens of outcomes. Outcomes compress complexity. They make events appear purposeful and directed. Living through the process feels aimless by comparison. Aimlessness does not feel historic. It feels frustrating. People living inside famous eras often complained rather than celebrated. They described confusion, disorder, or decline. These complaints fill historical records, but later interpretation reframes them as signs of transformation. Complaints feel ordinary. Transformation feels exceptional. Memory also distorts scale. Looking back, we compare eras across centuries. Living forward, people compared years or even seasons. Scale changes perception dramatically. What feels enormous across centuries feels subtle across years. Scale hides significance. Finally, Humans are not built to feel historic. We are built to adapt. Adaptation suppresses novelty. Suppressed novelty reduces emotional intensity. Without emotional intensity, nothing feels legendary. Legend belongs to memory, not to experience. This is why the most famous eras in history felt unremarkable to those living through them. They were too busy adapting, coping, and continuing. They did not know where their time would lead. They only knew what it demanded. And that is the quiet truth behind every famous age. History is never experienced as history. It is experienced as life, unfolding one ordinary day at a time. People living inside eras that later became famous also lacked something modern audiences take for granted: comparison at scale. They could not compare their present to distant futures or alternate timelines. They compared it only to what they personally remembered. This severely limited how dramatic change could feel. When comparison is short-range, transformation feels incremental rather than revolutionary. A person who lived 40 or 50 years might notice that certain things were different from childhood, but difference alone does not create historical awareness. Difference becomes meaningful only when it crosses a threshold of recognition. Most famous eras did not cross that threshold within a single lifetime. They unfolded across generations, and generational change feels like replacement, not transformation. Children grow up thinking the world they inherit is normal. Adults adapt to gradual shifts. Elders remember fragments that feel outdated rather than historic. At no point does the present announce itself as exceptional. This generational layering diluted perception. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that daily life absorbed shock faster than we expect. Institutions, routines, and social expectations act as buffers. When change occurs, it is filtered through these buffers. What reaches individuals is softened, delayed, and often reframed. A new system does not arrive fully formed. It arrives as instruction, adjustment, and compromise. People do not encounter history. They encounter its administrative shadow. That shadow feels mundane. Administration strips drama from change. Forms, schedules, and procedures translate abstract shifts into practical obligations. By the time people feel the impact, it no longer feels revolutionary. It feels bureaucratic. Bureaucracy is anti-dramatic by nature. This is why many transformative eras are remembered through documents rather than memories. Laws, records, and regulations capture change more clearly than personal testimony. Individuals remember inconvenience. Documents reveal transformation. This gap distorts modern perception. We imagine people living in famous eras surrounded by visible change. In reality, they were surrounded by continuity interrupted by paperwork. Another critical factor is uncertainty. While living inside an era, outcomes are unknown. Change without outcome feels directionless. Directionlessness prevents meaning. Meaning requires trajectory. Trajectory is visible only after the fact. People living through famous eras often felt anxiety rather than excitement. Anxiety narrows perception. It focuses attention on risk management rather than interpretation. People ask, how do I adapt? Not, what does this mean? Adaptation replaces reflection. Reflection requires safety. Safety is often absent during change. This explains why accounts from famous eras frequently emphasize instability, decline, or confusion. People sense disruption, but they could not contextualize it. Without context, disruption feels like disorder, not progress. Disorder feels ordinary during prolonged stress. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that dramatic moments were rare and short-lived. Even when something visibly changed, the moment passed quickly. Life resumed. Work continued. Responsibilities returned. Moments do not define eras while they are happening. Moments fade. Only later are they elevated. History compresses time. It places emphasis on select events and ignores the long stretches between them. People live in those stretches. Those stretches feel normal. Normality dominates experience. We also misunderstand famous eras because we assume people interpreted events the same way we do now. They did not. Interpretation evolves. Concepts, language, and categories change over time. People did not have the vocabulary to describe what they were living through as historic. Without vocabulary, awareness remains limited. Language shapes thought. If something cannot be named, it cannot be fully recognized. Most people living through famous eras lacked words for concepts we now consider obvious. Without those concepts, experiences remain fragmented. Fragmentation prevents synthesis. Synthesis is required for historical awareness. Another overlooked reason is that fame itself is retrospective. Eras become famous because of consequences, not because of experiences. Consequences unfold later. Living inside the cause does not feel like living inside the effect. Causes feel ordinary. Effects feel significant. People experience causes. History remembers effects. This mismatch guarantees that lived experience will feel smaller than remembered history. There is also the weight of normal expectations. Societies train people to expect continuity. Change is treated as temporary unless proven otherwise. People assume things will stabilize because they usually do. Assumption dulls awareness. Only when change proves permanent does it feel historic, and permanence takes time to establish. By the time permanence is recognized, the era is already over. Another factor is selective attention. People pay attention to what affects them directly. Large structural shifts often affect individuals indirectly at first. Indirect effects feel abstract. Abstract things feel distant. Distance reduces emotional impact. Reduced emotional impact reduces memorability. This is why many people living in famous eras later struggled to articulate what made their time special. They remembered hardship, effort, or confusion, not transformation. Transformation was not felt. It was inferred later. Famous eras also felt ordinary because people underestimated the future. They did not expect their present to be remembered. Memory bias leads us to assume that people knew they were living through something important. In reality, most people assume their time is unremarkable. Assuming ordinariness becomes self-fulfilling. If you believe your time is ordinary, you interpret it that way. Interpretation shapes memory. Memory shapes history. Another subtle reason is that responsibility anchors people emotionally. When people feel responsible for others, they prioritize continuity. Change becomes something to manage rather than something to observe. Observation requires detachment. Detachment is rare. Most people living through famous eras were not detached observers. They were participants under obligation. Obligation narrows perspective. This is why famous eras often feel quiet in personal accounts. People describe routines, not revolutions. They describe work, not meaning. Meaning was not accessible. Finally, famous eras felt ordinary because time itself moves at the speed of life. We imagine eras as blocks. People experience them as flow. Flow has no edges. Without edges, nothing feels bounded. Without bounds, nothing feels like an era. Only when time is cut, labeled, and framed does it feel distinct. That cutting happens later. Always later. This leads to an unavoidable conclusion. Historical significance is invisible from the inside. It emerges only when time has passed, when consequences are known, when narratives are formed, and when memory selects what to keep. People living through famous eras were not unaware. They were simply human. They lived, adapted, worried, and continued. And because of that, even the most famous eras felt like ordinary life unfolding, one unremarkable day at a time. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that people are not equipped to experience scale while living inside it. Scale is something the mind constructs through comparison, summary, and distance. While living inside an era, none of these tools are available. Life arrives in fragments, moments, and obligations. Scale dissolves into immediacy. People do not live inside centuries. They live inside mornings and evenings. Because of this, even when something enormous is happening structurally, it rarely feels enormous emotionally. Emotional response is proportional to immediacy, not magnitude. A small problem that demands attention now feels larger than a massive shift whose consequences unfold slowly. This is why structural change feels abstract while personal disruption feels real. Famous eras are defined by structural change. People experience personal disruption. The two rarely align. Another crucial factor is that systems absorb shock long before individuals recognize it. Institutions, markets, customs, and routines adjust incrementally. By the time change reaches the level of lived experience, it has already been normalized by layers of mediation. Normalization erases novelty. Once novelty disappears, so does the sense of significance. This is especially true in societies with strong administrative or social continuity. When systems continue to function, people assume stability even if the underlying logic of those systems is changing. Function masks transformation. As long as life continues, history feels paused. People also underestimate how much effort goes into maintaining normality during periods of change. Behind the scenes, institutions strain, compromise, and adapt to prevent collapse. That effort is invisible to most people. What they see is continuity. Continuity convinces them nothing extraordinary is happening. Extraordinary effort produces ordinary experience. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that fear does not translate into historical awareness. Fear narrows attention. It focuses the mind on avoidance, preparation, and coping. People living in famous eras often felt fear, uncertainty, or anxiety, but fear does not feel historic. It feels immediate. Fear asks, "What do I do now?" History asks, "What does this mean?" Those questions compete. The first always wins in real time. People living inside famous eras were often preoccupied with managing risk. They worried about livelihood, stability, and responsibility. These concerns dominated consciousness. Abstract significance had no room to emerge. Significance requires reflection. Reflection requires time and safety. Time and safety are often absent during change. Another factor is repetition. Even dramatic events become repetitive when they occur frequently enough. Repetition dulls response. Once the extraordinary becomes familiar, it stops feeling extraordinary. Famous eras often involve repeated disruptions. Over time, people adjust. Adjustment feels like normality. Normality erases awareness. This is why people living through famous eras often later say, "We didn't realize it at the time." They are not minimizing their experience. They are describing how adaptation suppressed perception. Adaptation is not awareness-friendly. Another overlooked reason is that most people do not interpret their lives as narratives. Narrative requires selection, emphasis, and closure. While living, people experience sequence, not story. Sequence feels endless. Story feels meaningful. Meaning appears only when sequence ends. As long as life continues, meaning remains unfinished. People living through famous eras did not know how their story would end. Without an ending, there is no story. Without a story, there is no sense of historical importance. This is why historical awareness often arrives after events conclude. Conclusion creates coherence. Another subtle factor is the absence of contrast. Contrast creates recognition. People living inside famous eras lacked a clear before and after while events were unfolding. They experienced only now, slowly drifting away from the past. Drift does not feel historic. Only rupture does. Most famous eras were defined by drift rather than rupture. Even when ruptures occurred, they were absorbed into ongoing life quickly. Work resumed. Obligations returned. Normality reasserted itself. Normality is persistent. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that individuals rarely see the full system they inhabit. They see their position within it. That position may change slowly or not at all, even while the system transforms around them. Systemic change does not guarantee experiential change. Many people lived entire lives during famous eras without experiencing dramatic personal shifts. Their routines persisted. Their concerns remained similar. Their sense of time remained local. Local experience hides global transformation. This mismatch between personal continuity and structural change is one of the strongest reasons historical significance remains invisible from the inside. Another important element is expectation. People generally expect continuity. When change occurs, they interpret it as temporary unless proven otherwise. Temporary problems do not feel historic. Only permanence creates significance. Permanence takes time to confirm. By the time permanence is recognized, the era is already past. People living through famous eras also lack the interpretive frameworks we use today. Concepts like modernity, transformation, or historical turning point are retrospective constructs. Without those frameworks, experience remains unstructured. Unstructured experience feels ordinary. Structure is imposed later. Another reason is the bias of memory. Memory favors what stands out emotionally. Much of historical change does not stand out emotionally while it is happening. It becomes emotionally visible only when viewed through consequence. Consequence reveals meaning. Meaning reveals significance. Both arrive later. Famous eras are remembered because of what they produced, not because of how they felt. People living inside them experience causes, not effects. Causes rarely feel important. Effects feel important. This guarantees a disconnect between lived experience and remembered history. People living inside famous eras often focused on managing decline or uncertainty rather than celebrating progress. Progress is easier to recognize in hindsight than in motion. Motion feels messy. Messy things do not feel meaningful. Another reason famous eras felt ordinary is that the human mind resists constant alertness. Sustained awareness is exhausting. Over time, attention relaxes. What once demanded notice becomes background. Background never feels historic. This attentional fatigue is adaptive. It allows people to function under prolonged change. Without it, anxiety would become unmanageable. Function requires normalization. Normalization suppresses awareness. Finally, famous eras felt ordinary because history is not designed to be experienced as history. It is designed to be lived. Living prioritizes continuity, survival, and adaptation. Meaning, scale, and narrative are secondary. Those secondary elements define history, but they do not define life. Life continues forward without annotation. Only later do we annotate it. And that is why the most famous eras in history felt quiet, ordinary, and unremarkable to the people living inside them. They were not unaware. They were simply human, moving forward through time without the luxury of hindsight. The most important truth about famous eras is not what happened during them, but how they were experienced. From the inside, history does not feel dramatic, meaningful, or clearly defined. It feels like continuity under pressure. People wake up, respond to what is required, adapt to small changes, and move on to the next day. Meaning does not arrive with events. It arrives after them. Famous eras only become famous once they are complete. Only when outcomes are visible can patterns be identified, causes connected, and significance assigned. While living inside those years, people lacked distance, scale, and narrative. They could not see arcs. They could only see moments. Moments feel ordinary. Change, when gradual, disguises itself as inconvenience rather than transformation. Institutions absorb shock. Routines normalize disruption. Responsibility narrows attention. Adaptation suppresses novelty. All of these forces work together to make even large historical shifts feel manageable and familiar. This is why people so often say, "We didn't realize it at the time." They are not understating their experience. They are describing the natural limits of human perception. History requires hindsight. Life does not provide it. Understanding this reframes how we think about the past and the present. If famous eras felt ordinary to those living through them, then our own time probably feels quieter than it deserves to. Significance is not something we feel. It is something others recognize later. History is not lived as legend. It is lived as routine, uncertainty, and adjustment. Only memory turns it into something larger. Thank you for staying until the end. If this perspective made you think differently about history and the present moment, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments.